Welcome everyone to session 4 on energy and transit. And I was just thinking about the logic of the panels, and this one is where we talk about material reality or something closer to material reality. And I'm excited for this conversation. And I am Kaija Schilde. I'm a professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and I'm delighted to be here to moderate this panel. First will be Bruce Jentleson, the William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Emily Holland, wait. Okay,
wait.
so
Oh, sorry.
yes, that's right. Okay.
I should apologize. Emily Holland unfortunately could not make it due to an illness, so we have in her stead Thomas Cavanna.
Thomas Cavanna, right? Or,
Yeah, visiting assistant professor at the Fletcher School.
At the Fletcher School, that's right. I know him, so it's not that big of a shock.
Okay.
So thank you. And Kelly Sims Gallagher, Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And then Mikhail Krutikhin, co-founder of RusEnergy. So with Bruce Jentleson.
Okay, let me turn my timer on. So much thanks to Dan for the invitation, Abe and Henry for their really stimulating articles. I think we've all had a sense of that. So this is actually happening at the same time that I was sort of going back to some of my academic roots. I actually started my dissertation and first book were on sanctions and East-West energy trade and various pipeline cases from the early 60s and early 80s. And so it's helped me get to this section in a broader perspective. I'm not going to talk so much about that particular issue today because I know my colleagues here have some very specifics we may come back to in the discussion. But I thought I'd talk more kind of the way Marty posed her comments about how some of these areas of energy and transit relate to the issues that are raised by the weaponized interdependence framework. And so the first point is the whole question of how weaponized interdependence-ish is energy. And it tends to be seen as very much like that. And ever since OPEC 1973, which was really quite the weaponization, that oil production was cut 25%, price increases were 325%, US and some other pro-Israel countries were fully embargoed. Writing at the time, the International Institute for Strategic Studies called it, quote, the first success ever obtained at the highest level of politics by economic sanctions. It was seared on the American psyche, right? So I actually owned this wonderful Mustang convertible, light blue, black interior, I thought it was very cool, gas guzzler. And I was used to getting, 28 cents a gallon. And it was like, this was my right as an American, right? It was either in, it's somewhere in the Constitution of the Bill of Rights. And so the impact of OPEC on the political culture and the psyche of Americans, I think, is one of the reasons why we tend to see energy as very WI-ish. But if you actually go back, and there's no question there's a lasting effect on the international political economy, but even then there was limited policy change on the crucial policy issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Despite all that, some adjustments in American policy, which I actually think had more to do with other factors like Sadat kicking the Russians out in 1971 and the way Kissinger. So even with this large economic impact, you didn't have the conversion to significant policy change. Somebody cited Steve Krasner's article, Oil is the Exception. He talks about why, in the 1970s, there were particular macroeconomic and other conditions. But even if you look at the geopolitics, it wasn't as much of an exception as we thought. And I think that's important to bear in mind as we think generally about energy in some of these other cases. So let me make 4 points about energy and transit that relate to this. So one, it's kind of, I raised a little bit yesterday, but I think these cases of energy and transit show how the WI conception of power in its own way can be overly structural and not sufficiently interactive or action, reaction, or coerce or target. And one of the lines in the article, Henry and Abe's article, states, quote, with political authority over the central nodes in the international network structures are able to leverage interdependent relations to coerce others, to try to coerce others, right? Because it's a very important point that comes out. And I would sort of bring back from the Cohen and I complex interdependence, kind of leaving that behind, the distinction they make between sensitivity and vulnerability. They define sensitivity as how quickly did changes in one country bring costly changes in another, and how great are those costly effects. Vulnerability is an actor's liability to suffer costs imposed by external events, even after policies have been altered. This really leads us, and Abe had this in there more in the direction for his research, to target state counter strategies in defense. by sanctions or other forms of WI. So you have economic substitution. One example, the UN sanctions against Rhodesia, 60s. In 1963, the range of manufacturing output in Rhodesia was 602 products. By 1970, it was 3,837. So there's a classic autarkic reaction to reduce the costs. There are alternative trade partners. Russia for Cuba, we had that comment about Cuban coffee being sold in Toronto. How many years later? Argentina for the Soviets when the U.S. imposed the grain embargo when we had 80% of the grain market. Various EU options that Mikhail talks about liquefied natural gas, the Southern Gas Corridor, and all. And there are various policy adjustments. So I think to get away from power too much as resources and power as influence, this notion of an action-reaction and a target state counter strategies is really important to bring into it. And it's not as much in the article, and we recognize that the article has its limits. Second point is sort of what I think of as currency convertibility. Is converting the leverage of converting economic costs to political strategic objectives. So even when costs have not been able to be substantially reduced, the target state counter strategies are not that great. There are actually few cases in which economic coercion has brought political leverage on issues in which a state is pressured into taking positions counter to priority interests. Now, in some cases, the costs are the objective, right? If you're trying to limit technologies and others that enhance somebody's military capabilities, that's your goal. It's not just a means to an end, but we're really talking about the use of WI to try to change policy and change behavior. Again, the OPEC 73 case actually speaks to that. That is the way we were posed with a question too about China and the Belt and Road Initiative. Does the Belt and Road Initiative represent an attempt by China to develop a real world structure of weaponized interdependence? Does it represent an intent? I think to an extent, although I subscribe to some of Alistair and Johnston's views of what China's motivations are. But whether or not it can do this is its own question. And the point about priority interest, can it use these relationships to change attitudes about Tibet and Taiwan? Probably, has already. When it comes to core geopolitical interests and ways in which I think inside the Beltway now people see this as very zero sum, we've got to watch this, to cite a famous article on military primacy that Dan wrote, that went back and showed there were less economic benefits from the power differential for the United States than would indicate. I think that the analysis of what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative, really has to take that into account. It's not clear that, there'll be some cases, Sri Lanka, where you get corruption and stuff, that the kind of geopolitical leverage that's going to come from this will be something of a huge magnitude. More broadly, think about this as, sort of actually I'm rereading Paul Kennedy about the dangers of overreaching that we dismissed because of, the end of the Cold War, etc. I think there's it's a lesson the U.S. I think should have learned. I think it's a lesson that Russia learned, may need to learn again. And I think it's a lesson for China as well. So I think that convertibility of economic cost to political leverage doesn't necessarily follow in a one-to-one relationship. Is the consequences of WI success, right? So one of the issues, and Rachel raised this morning about extraterritoriality and the issues that it relates to today. Well, again, going back to my earlier work, in the early 80s with the West Siberian natural gas pipeline, Margaret Thatcher, not just the Germans and the French, was enraged over this extraterritorial claim, right? This has been a sensitive point for a long time for other countries on economic grounds, on their own nationalism, on their own political standing. So one of the consequences is, intra-alliance relations or intra-partners. The other one is the escalatory risks that come, when you start to impose these costs on the target, that it has vulnerability. So what does it do? You hear the phrase, poke the Iranians or say uncle. Again, when you look at a lot of the sanctions things, there tends to be a point of diminishing returns for these kind of economic coercive measures. So what are we seeing in the Persian Gulf right now? We're seeing, counter strategies that are contributing to escalation. And, maybe there's a scenario in which, in a wag the dog way, a certain president might actually like to see escalation with the Iranians and away some of the heat. But let's just simply say, I don't think it's in the American national interest to do that. And so by imposing these costs of weaponized interdependence, you may not be achieving your objective in terms of your geostrategic objective, because the other side, not only in addition to its defense against the costs, can find ways to escalate with countermeasures. Venezuela is another example. There's been a lot of analysis that says that the tightening of American sanctions has hurt the opposition, further discredited the efforts of the Europeans and the Latin Americans to try to do some mediation. And so I think that that's also a factor that you can pay a price with your success. Last point, that's 40 seconds. And this relates back to the Iran case. And the case that's in the paper really corresponds to largely to the Obama JCPOA strategy. Abe, last night, if you read Bill Burns's memoirs, it would be really useful to you guys because it gives his account of the Iran talks in which he was in the lead. So to the extent that the financial pressure worked, it fits with the point of diminishing returns and the notion of proportionality. Any instrument you use coercively, limited military force or economic, it has to be proportional to the objectives you have. For a limited instrument to achieve regime change is a disproportionality between means and ends. In some ways this worked because you also had a reciprocity, that the pressure was being used to bring Iran to a deal in which the West, the P5+1 made certain concessions. And so that was a really interesting case. Doesn't carry over necessarily to WI, not just as coercive diplomacy, but as coercion, which is kind of where we are now, right? What's the objective here? And so the notion that by ratcheting up the economic pressure even more, doing more weaponization, make it more likely to achieve your objective. I think you end up in the scenarios I was talking about before, escalatory risk. And so I think the question of the use of these is they're always a part of, or they should be part of a larger strategy, right? There may be other elements of coercion. What is the objective? And the likelihood of success defined as achieving the objectives of the weaponized interdependence is related to what is the objective that it's pursuing. And I think that's another proportionality aspect that comes in. So anyway, those are just some points to throw into the mix on the particular topic and broadly for later conversation.
Cavanna.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cavanna. I am replacing Professor Holland, who unfortunately did not make it. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk in the next 10 minutes about my research and the connections between my research on the Belt and Road Initiative and America's Grand Strategy and the concept of weaponized interdependence. So the first point that I wanted to emphasize, and I think that most of you are very familiar with that point, but I think it's very important. There's a disclaimer to make about Belt and Road, especially if we look at the literature on Belt and Road, which is that many scholars, including many China experts, believe that there is no strategic intent behind Belt and Road, that Belt and Road is a slogan, or that it is a vehicle for corruption in domestic politics, or even among the people who think that there is a strategic dimension to it, there is this idea that China will not be able to sustain Belt and Road because of economic and political. So with that left aside, I'm going to try to draw some connections between Belt and Road and the concept of weaponized interdependence, which, as you know, is about leveraging asymmetric network structures as a cohesive tool, to quote Professor Farrell and Professor Newman. So it's about interdependence and it's about structural power. So if we try to look at the basics, and you're all familiar with those maps, which have emerged in the last 6 years, it is pretty straightforward to see that Belt and Road can be seen as a network, and even as a quasi-global network. If we think about the field of energy in transit, we have the nodes, we have the ports, the airports, the reactors, the coal plants. If we think about the ties, we have the roads, the railways, the pipelines, etc. So that's the first level, and it's pretty straightforward. However, the real question is to what extent can China leverage the Belt and Road in order to achieve a threshold of weaponized interdependence? And here, as I was thinking about it, I just went over the different criteria which are covered in this article that we all read. And I tried to think about the potential connection, potential affinities between Belt and Road on the one hand, and those criteria. So the first one is the existence of appropriate domestic institutions that you can leverage in order to coerce your adversaries, your competitors, private actors, etc., etc. It seems to me, first observation, very straightforward, that if we think about this criterion, China is doing reasonably well because of state control. Without idealizing state control, it is pretty clear that China can leverage institutions, influence institutions, create institutions which could be used in order to weaponize interdependence and in order to hurt competitors and rivals. Second point, compatibility with domestic norms, with domestic law, with private actors' preferences, the points that were mentioned in the talk yesterday. And here again, it seems to me that on first look, it seems that China would be able to work around those different factors in a rather easier way than the United States or other democracies, for example. The ability to play with those constraints, to tame those constraints, or to work around those constraints is, in my opinion, higher for the Chinese government than for the American government. Finally, and that is actually the most important, weaponized interdependence supposes the ability to leverage asymmetric network structures for cohesion. It is at the heart of the definition, as I understand it. My response would be that if we look at Belt and Road in the field of energy and transit, we do not see the same kind of degree of interdependence, of asymmetry, and of structural power that we can find in the domain of financial messaging and in the domain of the internet, the two domains that are covered in the article where the United States has such an overwhelming structural position. There are several reasons for this. I wanted to mention three of them. The first one is a geographic distance and the dispersion of energy resources across the world, for example. So that is going to create a number of constraints on anyone who wants to centralize control. We can also think about market structure, and I think that you mentioned this in your article, the fact that oil markets, for example, are sufficiently diversified so that there is no single point of control. So that is a very powerful limitation when we think about energy sectors. Finally, there is also the fact that even though, as you know, Belt and Road has spread across, I think, about 150 countries at this point, many different regions, Eurasia and beyond, there is the fact that the networks of Belt and Road cohabitate with other networks which are pushed forward, promoted by other powers, which were less important than China, less big than China, less powerful, can also have a say in the future of those networks and can offer alternatives to Belt and Road. Here I'm thinking about India, Japan, Russia, the EU, the United States. So that is pretty straightforward. So for that reason, I think that we need to be cautious when we think about weaponized interdependence and Belt and Road in the field of energy and transit. That said, I think that it's still interesting to think about Belt and Road and weaponized interdependence and to try to connect what Belt and Road can achieve with the two main effects which are mentioned in this article on weaponized interdependence, the panopticon effects on the one hand and the choke point effect. The panopticon effects, which is the ability to use physical access to or jurisdiction over hub nodes to obtain information. First thoughts that came to my mind as I was thinking about this was how China can use different infrastructure, transit and energy infrastructure, which are built along the Belt and Road Initiative in order to collect intelligence and in order to indulge in industrial espionage against many other countries. So that could be domestic societies abroad, that could be the actions of a certain number of governments, that could also be the United States, and more specifically, that could also be American military assets. There was a controversy a few months ago, for example, about how China could leverage its control over some ports in Israel in order to conduct intelligence on America's military activities in the Eastern Mediterranean and on the military assets themselves that America had deployed in Israel. Effects. The second major effect of weaponized interdependence, so it's about limiting or penalizing the use of hubs by third parties. So here again, keeping in mind the limitations that I mentioned before, I think that we can see some potential connections, affinities between Belt and Road and these choke point effects. For example, the way the building of energy infrastructure across Belt and Road could legitimize China's military deployments, prepositioning of military assets in certain countries, certain regions. The way China could influence energy governance and progressively reshape energy governance in a way that would facilitate the use of choke point effects in the future. If we think about the very long term. I was also thinking about Belt and Road tribunals. When there is a conflict with the Belt and Road project, this conflict in most cases is going to be solved in a Belt and Road tribunal located in China, which is to say, of course, that the Chinese government can interfere and could interfere with some cohesion effects in mind. I'm also thinking about the way the Chinese could use their growing influence in port management in Europe, for example, in order to progressively boost the traffic of their own Chinese transportation companies at the expense of European transportation companies. Ultimately, according to some scholars, put out of business those European transport companies, which would, of course, increase China's strategic leverage over those European countries. So that is an argument out there. There is also the fact that Belt and Road could help lock on strategic metals and minerals. So an argument, quite controversial, not everyone agrees with it, that China could potentially, in time of crisis, be tempted to assume control or to use its leverage in some of the strategic infrastructures of Belt and Road members. For example, some people fear that China could acquire enough influence over nuclear reactors in Britain to be able to weigh on the thinking of the British leaders. There is also the same kind of thinking with regards to ports in Gwadar, Pakistan, or Ambantota, Sri Lanka. However, at the end of the day, and to come back to what I said before, I think that if there is one actor that is able to get closer to the threshold of weaponized interdependence that we are thinking of in the context of this article, it is the United States. And as I was thinking about transit and energy and the potential use of weaponized interdependence across space, the one concept that came to mind was the common of the commons concept, which was presented by Barry Posen a few years ago, which is about the United States having achieved such a level of superiority in order to deploy assets in all of the commons of the world. And the United States also presenting itself as the defender of the free flow of energy worldwide. And it seems to me that China is very, very far from that kind of overarching position. Context, I think that, at least for now, because of course Belt and Road is only in its infancy, it could be the story of several decades before it reaches full speed. But I think that for now, it may be less interesting to think about Belt and Road as an instrument that will allow China to weaponize interdependence, as Belt and Road as an instrument which could help the Chinese blunt America's potential weaponization of interdependence in the field of transit and energy, to the extent that we can talk about weaponization of interdependence in those fields. I was thinking about the concept that you mentioned yesterday, how actors can resist those pressures coming from weaponized interdependence, and trying to think about it in the context of Belt and Road. I was thinking in terms of insulation, the fact that the Chinese, thanks to Belt and Road, diversify routes, pipelines, and energy partners, make it more difficult for the United States to close all of those relationships if they really want to inflict coercion on the Chinese. There is also the fact that those assets that China deploys as it develops the transit/energy dimensions of Belt and Road could ultimately be used to constrain America's mobility. We could mention the base that China opened in Djibouti in 2017. We could also mention intelligence on US assets. Deterrence retaliation, one example could be how the Chinese could increase the diplomatic cost of America's intervention. If China has more energy partners, more partners connected to China's territory, it will be more difficult diplomatically for the United States to consider a blockade. I was also thinking about counter-narrative, the fact that the Belt and Road and China's rising responsibilities and the protections of sea lines of communication, for example, could diminish the centrality of America's role when it comes to sea lines of communication, and as a result could reduce America's ability to practice threat inflation against China. And finally, there is the way Belt and Road could help the development of counter networks in energy and energy governance, as I mentioned, other dimensions. So my final word would be to also consider the affinities, the connections between Belt and Road in transit and energy, and how this Belt and Road in transit and energy helps China's influence in terms of commerce, financial norms, monetary norms, technical standards, and telecommunications.
Next will be Kelly Sims Gallagher.
Oh, I think it's me, yeah. Yeah, okay, all right.
I must have a bad.
It's fine, no.
Okay.
Okay, well, great. I think I'm going to focus my remarks, tempting as it is to think about energy flows, oil and gas markets. I'm going to focus my remarks mostly on the BRI because I've been doing a lot of work on the BRI lately. And I want to start by just sort of putting on the table very explicitly some of the theories that have been posited about the BRI and what's behind it. And Mark mentioned one earlier. So I think the first and leading one, especially in audiences like this, is that it's a geopolitical ploy to tie, all these countries to China and make them dependent on China. Second is that it's an ingenious method for coping with surplus capacity in the domestic market as you undergo a massive economic reform domestically. And Justin Yifu Lin, has advanced that thought a lot. And he's argued that, China had adopted a comparative advantage, defying economic strategy by investing so heavily in traditional industry, and naturally now is trying to move into a service-based economy. Third, winning the hearts and minds of Asia, Europe, Africa, even Latin America now, actually helping developing countries with poverty alleviation and economic development. Advancing the China development model is another one. Ensuring access to oil and gas or minerals and metals. And then I had never thought about it quite this way until I started thinking about it in the context of this workshop conference, ensuring a system maybe of weaponized interdependence. I think I'd like to argue that there's some evidence for all of these theories when you look at them empirically. I think, just China's establishment of various port infrastructures is a good example of how it's exercising itself geopolitically. On the question, on the theory of, whether China's just trying to deal with all of its surplus capacity in the domestic market, we wrote a paper last year looking at the policies governing China's overseas investments, compare them with the policies governing China's domestic investments. We revealed something very interesting. In both cases, there are lists that the National Development Reform Commission keeps that are lists of industries that are prohibited from being lent to, like the state banks cannot lend to those sectors. There's restricted sectors and there's encouraged sectors. And if you compare the lists for outbound investment versus for domestic investment, it reveals that in terms of domestic investment, all the heavy, traditional, dirty industry is on the restricted list now. Some of it is even on the prohibited list. Like, you are no longer allowed to invest in conventional automobile production. You're no longer allowed to invest in coal domestically. However, those two industries are not even on the restricted list for outbound investment. So what this reveals is that there's a tacit encouragement of exporting those industries, that kind of finance, the equipment related to those industries overseas. And mines, and actually helping developing countries with poverty alleviation and economic development. So 2 weeks ago, I was at the UN Climate Summit in New York. And just because I happened to be there, I went up to the Council on Foreign Relations for a breakfast with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the new Prime Minister of Pakistan. And there was a very revealing exchange that I'm going to read to you. I got the transcript. It was so interesting. Richard Haas said, "I want to talk to you about your relationship with China. Pakistan is on the short list of countries that receives the most Belt and Road investment from China. So there's really two questions that flow from it. Won't this dramatically exacerbate your debt challenge given the nature of Chinese support? And how does Pakistan make the claim that it's going to retain full sovereignty, given that it's allowing or inviting China to do projects on such a scale?" And Prime Minister Khan answered, just say the situation which we found ourselves in when 13 months ago we came into power was probably the worst economic situation. And so China really helped us when we were right at rock bottom. They helped us, they supported us by giving us funds for our foreign exchange reserves. At that time, we were staring at a default. So China helped us, along with Saudi Arabia and UAE, to beef up our reserves. And what China offers us right now is an opportunity. They have a 2 trillion import market. And China has given us preferential trade treatment where we can export to China at the same terms as the ASEAN countries. So this is a great opportunity. From that, we have this opportunity to get Chinese industry to relocate in Pakistan, bring in technology. So China has given us a great opportunity to lift ourselves up from where we are right now. The conversation went on, and every person who asked a question tried to press him on China, and he refused to criticize China, not even a little bit, not even over their treatment of the Uyghurs. And I think that this is so telling because later he says, what is my most important goal? What is my top priority? Poverty alleviation. And who is here to help us? Only China. And he pointedly said, the United States is doing nothing to help us in this regard. So I think we have evidence that they're winning in hearts and minds, and they are, in fact, actually helping with economic development. Another example of that, I've been doing increasing work in Ethiopia. China has invested, yes, in this port in Djibouti, but they also helped the Ethiopians build a high-speed all-electric rail fueled by a new wind farm. And this is giving Ethiopia access to a port that it has not had before. So here's a pretty good example of, well, is that geostrategic and political, or is this actually helping them? Very straightforward development. Definitely a lot of interest in China's development model. And when you travel in places like Ethiopia, you can see they're trying very hard to learn from it. That quote I just gave you from Pakistan is another example where they want to understand China's development model. They would love to replicate it. And then, of course, lots of state-owned enterprises are, in fact, asked to make investments that are clearly questionable. In interviews I've done, they have said we would prefer not to have to make these investments, but we're being asked to make these investments. And then they have to go and defend themselves in front of SASAC, which is the State-Owned Asset Supervision administration in China. And that's very uncomfortable for them because their financial performance is poor, but yet they're being forced by the very same state to go make these investments, clearly for geopolitical. So when I think about is BRI a threat somehow, it really raises interesting questions about agency to me. And so we actually, and I mostly work on climate change issues, we were very interested in whether BRI was being used, why the BRI was being used to support so much coal construction around the world. And from a climate point of view, this is a disaster. That's not really what this conference is about. And so our hypothesis, based on the work we had done, revealing that there was this tacit encouragement that the traditional industries, should export all of their technology, was that China would be, in fact, pushing technology and related finance on developing countries. And so we decided to look at the 4 countries that have received the most investment from China for coal, which are in order: India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. And India, by the way, is not a BRI country and vociferously opposes BRI, but has been happy to take lots of Chinese finance, not only for coal, but for lots of things. And our hypothesis empirically had revealed that there was absolutely no evidence at all that the Chinese were pushing this coal. And in every case, based on hundreds of interviews we did, these host countries, these recipient countries, were actively asking for coal finance and equipment from the Chinese. So I think that this sort of reveals that the agency here is really important to investigate empirically, because if it's the recipient countries that are asking for these investments, then you really have to, ask yourself whether this is really. I'll leave it there.
Mikhail is our last speaker.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this event. It's tremendously interesting for me. Well, when I'm speaking about what's going on in Russia, sometimes I feel I'm describing another planet. I can present a case study. Well, Gazprom is a notorious political weapon of the Kremlin. If you listen to the media, both sometimes in Russia and abroad. Well, if you take a look at the company, is it an efficient political weapon? Well, has it helped change any governments first? Has it helped change a political orientation of any country? We do not see such evidence that he has ever did this. It's the opposite. Gazprom has capitalized on pro-Russian and pro-Soviet even feelings and lobbies in other countries to promote its commercial goals. First, it's to raise prices, form joint ventures, acquire assets, establish corrupt intermediaries, and so on and so forth. That is to do something through local lobbies to establish, to do something which is called monopoly practices, as investigators from the European Commission termed that. Well, we see, yes, monopoly practices. Is Gazprom changing? Can we say that it is the process of the taming of the shrew? Yes, Gazprom has changed its strategy noticeably. It used to insist on high prices in oil-indexed long-term contracts, regardless of the shrinkage of market niches. Now, Gazprom focuses on keeping and expanding market niches, regardless its losses and prices. Then, now, most of the sales of Gazprom are hub indexed, gas to gas, but not indexed by oil. And Gazprom offers fantastic terms to new customers. It's just the price at the nearest hub plus a small cap commission. No politics, nothing. Just take it. It has an electronic trading platform, and you can buy gas anywhere in Europe at very convenient terms. Has dropped all allegedly politicized clauses in its agreement with gas buyers. Gazprom does not insist on prevention of its gas re-exports. Some corrupt intermediaries have been eliminated, Bulgaria and some other countries. Gazprom has adopted a strategy of full compliance with the anti-monopoly rules of the European Union. Now even the investigators, they launched the investigation against monopoly practices of Gazprom in 2012, say they have nothing to complain about because Gazprom has in advance fulfilled all their wishes and became basically, well, a civilized company that can be trusted in trade relations with the consumers of Russian gas. But we can say that only the president of Russia still believes that the Gazprom is a political weapon, not not Gazprom itself. First, it is his idea of punishing Ukraine, regardless of costs, because he wants to deprive Ukraine of 2 billion euros of annual revenues from transit of gas at the cost of building fantastically expensive gas corridor from the Yamal Peninsula in Arctic, new one, instead of the perfectly well operating old pipeline system. That, I have a document from Gazprom that was approved by Gazprom in 2008, which says that the cost of building that pipeline from the pipeline system from the Yamal Peninsula halfway to the Baltic is $92 billion. It is not 13, it is not $10 billion, as they say the cost of the Nord Stream 2 is. This is not publicized in Russian newspapers, but we have the documents, and they are not secret. They were signed by the local government of Nenetsk district and so on. Putin's idea of blackmailing the European Union with the pivot to the east or pivot to Asia. Putin on 2 occasions said, well, we are going to connect the eastern pipelines with western pipelines, and we will switch the flow of gas from Asia to Europe and backwards where the price is convenient. It's an attempt at blackmail, and he does not understand that looking at the map, there is a whole big system of pipelines going into Europe, and the demand is still exists in Europe. But with China, it's just one small pipeline and no significant plans to increase imports of Russian gas. Of course, he is trying to use Gazprom to establish pro-Russian lobbies and to finance pro-Russian lobbies in Europe. And then using Gazprom to bribe corrupt politicians in Europe. It is called Schroederization right now. And it's the cause of shame to all the Germans, as I believe, and I witnessed it many times in Germany. Well, okay, we have one guy who believes that Gazprom still is a political weapon. And we have a group of persons, individuals, very good friends and personal friends of our president, which capitalize on his political plans about Gazprom. They encourage launching absolutely unnecessary, redundant mega projects with no commercial value, such as Nord Stream, South Stream, Turkish Stream, Sakhalin, Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, Power of Siberia, Altai, and a lot of such projects. Their ties to Putin help them secure pipeline construction contracts without competition. And the budgets of those contracts are about triple the budgets of regular contractors in other countries with the same complexity of the construction. Chooses the most expensive options for such projects. Well, and the budgets are grossly exaggerated. In fact, Gazprom is not a political weapon. It is an instrument, but not of politics, but of embezzlement. We see that state-controlled funds of Gazprom are transferred into the pockets of private contractors who happen to be very good friends of Mr. It is one of 2 principal functions of Gazprom, along with producing and supplying natural gas to consumers. And now we have a possible scenario. What happens to Gazprom? Because right now, Gazprom is experiencing 4 kinds of very strong pressure. First, it is the pressure from anti-monopoly regulators of the European Union. They insist on third-party access to its pipelines. They insist on independent operator of the pipeline that goes into Europe. And this is a very big pressure, because if Gazprom obeys, then Russia will have to change the federal law which enables Gazprom to be the monopoly exporter of gas, and then they will liberalize the domestic market when other producers of gas will be allowed to export their own gas as well. It's a way to a great reform of the Russian gas market. Second type of pressure, it's the financial pressure of those redundant new pipelines. Prices are very low. Gazprom is actually in the red to finance those Altais and whatever the company is building. Then we see that in Russia right now, the emphasis is not on piped gas, because Russians understand that there is a limit to the capacity of those markets. It is LNG, which is now the fashionable idea of the Kremlin, especially with the success of the Yamal LNG projects. And Putin was very, very happy when he saw that it has been accomplished with economy of costs and very efficiently exports LNG even to Boston, Massachusetts, and to Puerto Rico, not only to other places of the world. And then we see that for Gazprom, there is the end of the mega projects programs. In 2 years, it will be no more great projects for Gazprom to finance. And so the contractors feel that they have accomplished their idea of capitalizing on the political ideas of the president. They need to switch to something else. And I believe that a reform is looming for the Russian gas market. First, I think it is possible to establish an independent gas transition operator, TSO, which will be just like Transneft, which is in governmental control and transport oil and refined petroleum products. Then it will be unbundling of producing and marketing units of Gazprom. And then it will be, I believe, it will be privatization of those upstream units with the tremendous, absolutely gigantic reserves, which can be used to launch new LNG projects. I think those cronies of Mr. Putin who are now making money constructing unnecessary pipelines are going to use new money. They are selling their construction companies to Gazprom right now. Very high price, absolutely unjustified price. And I believe they will be using that money to privatize companies of Gazprom, which possess huge reserves in Arctic and elsewhere, and get engaged in very promising LNG business. Thank you.
I wanted to take my position and ask a question that might help do some agenda setting work. I'd like this panel to do more agenda setting work for the larger project because I think there's a unique opportunity here, and I'll explain what I mean. So the two questions posed to the panel were, does the phenomenon of weaponized interdependence extend to physical networks such as road and pipelines? I think the answer was yes, in different contexts and conditions. And then the second question was, does the Belt and Road Initiative represent an attempt by China to develop a real world structure of weaponized interdependence? I think that there's nuance interjected into this analysis. To push the panel, and this is a little unfair because it's not a question that was posed to them, but I'm inspired by the panel last night, the roundtable. And it occurs to me that these questions are somewhat presentist in terms of describing our current environment politically. There's an opportunity here with something as materially real as infrastructure and physical networks. Because it occurs to me that some of the previous topics, such as cyber and finance, suffer from, they're fascinating topics, but they suffer from the fact that both interdependence and weaponization has been happening in the last 25, 30 years kind of simultaneously. It's a little difficult to hack. But with energy in transit and just anything with physical reality in general, you're looking at a longer durée. There's a longer phenomenon of both weaponization and or interdependence. And so I heard a story of interdependence with de-weaponization. But I also know that there are, prior to our current era of interdependence, a lot of stories about dependence and weaponization. And so I think there's a hypothesis building opportunity here. And I just wanted to make a plug, actually, something I was thinking about. The last panel was a colleague of mine. She's a diplomatic historian. Her name is Joyita Sarkar. She's writing a book about nuclear supplier markets. And I read a fascinating story she wrote that said in the 1970s, it was actually a decline in US market share in energy markets and nuclear energy markets that led the US to create forums like the New York Nuclear Suppliers Group and commissions, and then to throttle back its supply of nuclear energy to foreign markets. It hurt itself, but it hurt the Europeans more. And so what's interesting about that story is it's prior to our current era of interdependence, first of all. So it speaks a little bit to Stacey Goddard's push to think about other worlds and other configurations. But I also think that our current era is conditioning us to think that weaponization is associated with strength, a powerful node. Whereas that story of weaponization in earlier eras, I don't know if it has to do with earlier eras, but it's an example of weaponization being associated with weakness or lack of market share. And so I just wanted to say that would be in the conversation, but I wanted to push you because I think there's a real opportunity here for this topic about infrastructure really helping agenda set because it can speak to other eras of interdependence and weaponization. I don't know if anyone wanted to react to that.
It's been really interesting for me and your question. I mean, I guess I'd just make a couple of points thinking about this and where we've been. One is to use this sensitivity vulnerability distinction. So it seems to me that weaponized interdependence speaks to the increasing sensitivity variety of states, whether it's, through pipelines, if they're BR, through a variety of other things, to the imposition of economic costs, whether by a state or by private sector. Vulnerabilities are more limited, partly because of counter strategies. And I think, to me, the broader thing about this with the BRI in particular, broader geopolitical context, I think, looking forward, where we are and where we might be going, is what I think of as sort of the pluralization of diplomacy, right? That most states in the world, very few states in the world, with one team or the other, China, Russia, United States, and they have options, right? What you see, is that gives you a certain amount of, alternative strategies, a little bit of counter leverage, if you feel you're being pushed too hard on certain things, and maybe not always in the moment. You may have to make certain concessions under certain pressure. Broader context of this role, and you see it everywhere. I mean, in the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the China in the port of, I think it's in the port of Haifa thing is really interesting. This is like the Allies supposed to be, totally in debt to the United States, and even they decided to make this particular deal for their own reason. So I think in some respects, the real interest, to me, one of the questions here is the conversion of economic impact to political influence. And the other point is just going back, we, American foreign policy and IR, we treated the post-World War II era, not just the end of history, but as if like, it really was more the exception than the rule. And if you think about how we got to where we were, after World War II, Europe and Japan were, to reconstruct. The Iron Curtain went up, and most of the rest of the world were colonies, and the United States economy was in good shape. We did a lot of things to stimulate it, and the middle class was expanding. Maybe 1971, the Nixon shock was the beginning of a shift from that. So if we can get out of our head the notion of the normalcy of this, U.S.-dominated period, so when we're losing market share, it's not a total surprise, right? What we had might have been artificial. Anyway, that's my sense of how to put this all in.
Why don't we go down the line? A little bit out of order last time.
I'll skip, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can add something. Well, at the previous panel, I wanted to make a contribution to the discussion because that was about finance. There is a very good case of interdependence of two great global networks, which I think is the importance of which is underestimated. And this interdependence is counterproductive and vulnerable in terms of stability, this global stability, both economically and maybe in terms of energy security. Well, Thomas quoted a line from your article, which is oil markets are sufficiently diversified, no single point of control at all. But we see right now that the price of oil is determined no longer by the balance of supply and demand, but by gambles on the financial market. Gambles are fantastically, sometimes stupid, absolutely, sometimes unpredictable. We see that, yes, we can identify the names of about 51 very big scale players on the financial markets who are trading in oil futures. And, there are algorithms, so to say, when they identify some news, some specific words of news about a tanker has sunk, or there was an attack on oil facilities, or something happened, or some guy made a declaration. Immediately, you witness the price of the futures of oil going up or going down, 3%, 6%. And then, the this it's not flexibility, it's fluctuation of oil prices does not depend on the actual oil market or behavior of producers and consumers of oil. It's impossible to change the price of oil immediately, even if you take a couple of tankers out of the chain of the delivery. All a gamble. I remember last year in February, about 20 big players decided to sell simultaneously some big packages of future contracts. And the price just went down very noticeably. I think either something has to be done about this sort of interconnection, but potentially this is a weapon. Potentially, when we see well, you have your SEC, which is watching over the U.S. Stock market, but in Russia, the Russian stock market is governed by, well, several individuals or not groups, not organizations, which deal in insider information. For example, they ask the Minister of Energy to make a statement, which is an absolutely stupid statement that is, well, very far from reality. And the price goes up or the price goes down. Sometimes even the presidents make such statements that the Russian market reacts. So it's we do not have such a regulatory office which could, well, it's a criminal offense in many countries. When some country can use those players, if they are corrupt enough or maybe involved in some sort of gambling, to affect this global market as well. I think we're underestimating the danger.
Yes, two thoughts very quickly. Yeah, I think the point that you make about the fact that, you know, transit and energy, you can go further back in history to try to draw some lessons and make some analogies, as risky as analogies can be. I think that it's interesting. It could be an avenue for research. And as far as Belt and Road is concerned, it seems to me that many people are detached from those historical realities. They're not really trying to make those connections, but that would definitely be interesting. Another thought on the what Professor Jentleson mentioned about the conversion of a impact to political impact, and the fact that China may encounter difficulties when it comes to converting its economic power into political influence over allies. I think it's very true. I think that's what's also interesting. What I try to do in my work on Belt and Road and U.S. grand strategy is to see that maybe in some ways, in some cases, China does not necessarily gain a lot of political impact over a host country, for example, Israel and the port of Haifa. It's not about influence over the state of Israel. But even though China does not necessarily gain that much political influence over the state of Israel, China is still able to create an asset in Israel, in the port of Haifa, which can create real problem for the hegemon, for the United States, and maybe counter this kind of across-the-board dominance that the United States has across space with its military dominance, for example. So I think it's interesting to disaggregate the political impact on the host country from the capacity of China to create problems for the United States.
And I'm going to apologize because this might be a little more of a comment. Like, there's a question at the end, which is, from everything I've heard so far, I'm struck by two things. The first is the degree to which, in the previous panels on both finance and the internet, the degree to which the sort of expertise required to understand how these networks work is completely beyond the capacity of most political leaders, which would help to explain how they wind up getting into these networks, getting trapped by weaponized interdependence in the first place. So that's an example where a lack of expertise causes states to underestimate the potential vulnerabilities they're leaving themselves for. I do wonder, as you point out, this is like an older form of weaponized interdependence, and the overall theme from this panel is that by and large, the coercive leverage that can be gained from this is not nearly as large as is commonly thought by political leaders. So this is another case where political elites are stupid, but they're stupid biased in the opposite direction. In other words, they actually exaggerate the potency of these networks in a way that they underestimate the potency of the other networks. which then I guess leads to my question. Weirdly, are these sorts of transit networks or energy networks potentially more useful than you're giving them credit for? Not because they actually exercise leverage, if they're ever implemented in that way, but because everyone looks at them, thinks they could be used like this. And so there's almost, you know, much like in the case of sanctions, where the most potent sanctions are the ones you never have to use, is it also the case that actors in these networks actually have more autonomy than people realize, but they're too stupid to realize that. They're exaggerating the potency, and so as a result, this actually does give actors like Russia and China more leverage than we would otherwise anticipate.
I would say, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that just a couple, actually, I would add to it. You know, so Thomas' presentation of the BRI and Kelly's, and also the comments of the Pakistani Prime Minister, that part reminded me of the old, you know, line about Willie Sutton, the bank robber. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is, right? You know, China has chosen to dedicate an enormous amount of resources. So it's no surprise. And even if the United States, you know, if there's different president, you know, 1985, 2000, in real terms, the budget of foreign affairs and State Department went down 50%, right? So, I mean, I think that's not surprising, but I actually think, yeah, that it comes in with this, what for me at least is a overly hawkish Cold War view, new Cold War view of the BRI. Oh my God, anything that's good for China has to be bad for us.
Right.
It's zero sum, and it's and so it
Really,
even
the
leads
US is almost actually gifting them power by
Right.
acting the way that they're acting.
and also, you know, in terms of its own strategies of how it might compete with China, it's misallocating resources, right? So all of that buys in, and then the oil thing to me comes again. I think it's political. You know, that OPEC was so shocking to the American psyche that we have stayed there. You know, including all the right things that Barry talks a lot about in terms of, you know, President of the Persian Gulf, et cetera. So it doesn't mean that there's not short-term costs and that they're not relative gains. I think there were some points Thomas made about some, you know, relative gains China can make, you know, and Kelly's making similar points, but that's different than game changer, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think part of what's happening is that in these BRI countries, it's almost like the US has become irrelevant. I say, you know, we are not actually offering an alternative anymore. And therefore we are, you know, the whole Pakistan conversation was just so bizarre because, you know, all we care about there is terrorism and the military gain. And all Prime Minister Khan wants to do is achieve economic development. And maybe I'm making these, you know, artificially stark. But he was clearly implying over and over and over again, I wish the US would do something to help me with my development problems. And we're not, right? So I do think that this gets back to the argument I was trying to make about agency. Are these countries willingly getting themselves meshed with China? Well, yes, in the sense that they see China as a way, giving them the resources to accomplish goals that they're trying to achieve, and it's not like they have really good alternatives. So it goes back to agency.
Just one comment about the more hawkish view. I very much agree, and I think it's not something that I delved into because it was not really at the heart of the topic. But I think it's possible to say that Belt and Road could create problems for the United States, but to say at the same time, like the United States should double down and get more involved and be more proactive in some of those regions, but maybe use this as an opportunity. Think beyond the zero-sum game, to think that maybe China is going to increase its influence in Cambodia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Does the United States really need to compete? Or could the United States leaders think that maybe China is just going to focus its money and attention on regions that are not particularly strategically important to the United States? And I think there's also an argument to make that this expansion of Chinese influence, provided American leaders are less immediately bluntly opposed to it, could offer opportunities for cooperation in the realm of economic development, counterterrorism, protection of sea lines of communication. And I completely agree that you mentioned overreach, overextension. That could be an opportunity for American leaders, instead of going forward with kind of full-on opposition to whatever China is doing and demonization of whatever China is doing. Maybe it could be a way for American leaders to rethink the fundamentals of their grand strategy about areas and domains in which the United States are overextended and would be better off focusing on its own people and on some regions at the expense of others. So I
Just to add one thing, when you posited the United States as a hegemon, the United States has not been a hegemon for a long time, right? And you can go back to previous administration, we couldn't get Pakistan a long time to do what we wanted to do. We couldn't get, the Obama administration couldn't get Israel to do what we want to do. We haven't been able to get the Saudis. We had, NATO allies. So the notion of we're a hegemon and we're losing some of that hegemon, we're a major power with lots of influence competing against them. But the notion of hegemon just doesn't really accurately describe strategic reality of, recent times.
I would disagree, but yeah, I understand. I mean, for me, hegemon doesn't mean like all powerful, but the United States can deploy more easily across different regions of the world militarily and has, kind of very central influence in many international organizations. So, and it seems to me they play in a league of its own. I mean, in a league of its own compared to many other countries. I completely agree that there are many things that the United States, even at the highest level of its power, could not have.
So I don't know if this is a comment or a question, so I'll try to do both. It seems to me that we spend a lot of time talking about decarbonization and alternative energies, which means that everything that has been discussed here in terms of pipelines and liquefied natural gas and oil is rendered largely secondary, if not unimportant. And so I'm wondering, moving forward, what does energy look like? Because it doesn't look like, if it does, we're done. And if it doesn't, then what does it look like? And there are two possibilities. I don't think they're mutually incompatible. One is we aren't in a world in which we have a centralized reservoir of energy that we extract and distribute. We're in a very decentralized world in which we harvest solar and wind from a very diffuse set of harvesting devices, if you will, which means the geopolitics of energy are no longer about extracting the raw materials. So that's one. So do you think that's true, and how quickly are we moving to that world? Question is, then what does the competition over energy become a competition about? And is it then a competition over energy? And over technology, the technologies we use to collect, store, and transmit this energy. And how is that going to evolve over the next 15 to 20 years? Because it seems to me, we as the US talk a lot about energy independence. We're not really doing so well in that dimension. But that seems to be the critical dimension moving forward. It's a comment or two questions, but those are kind of the things that occur to me as I listen.
I'm going to take two because I think they're linked. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to come at some of the points that Thomas just made from a different perspective, and tying into this question of, how does energy fit? Because I take in particular of attempts to weaponize these networks didn't really work well, depending on work. But I almost wonder if this has been a case where there's been some degree of redundancy built into the system, and maybe the sort of question marks about other sources of energy have reinforced that. But we have had interest from Russia's side, maybe embezzlement and corruption, but also an interest of saying, well, let's build in some different ways to get our gas to Europe, to the end user, so we're less reliant on transit countries. You've had, because of market dynamics and policy dynamics, a significant increase in U.S. Liquid, sort of fuel production. So you have a sort of a different space where it's harder to control some of those choke points. And I'm struck in looking at this by the fact that, if anything, it's not been energy producers, so to speak, or even China that's been trying to energy networks. It's been maybe the U.S. and others through financial channels indirectly. And I'm not saying that was effective, but I'm just wondering whether this sort of demand, this increasing shift of supply and demand means that maybe the energy networks, how much have they shifted?
First, decarbonization. Well, if you compare, things go so fast that I cannot just grab them at the right moment and start analyzing them. a year ago in Berlin, there was an expert talks, very good experts discussed energy issues, and they hydrogen just once as some sort of an addition to natural gas and so for fuel purposes. And so now this year, the same group of experts in Berlin, they discussed mostly hydrogen. This is a new fashionable word. And well, if we look at two different prognoses, one made by the European Commission, they say maybe by 2050, it will be 100% decarbonization. In Europe, we're not going to need natural gas, coal, oil, or anything else. That's the outlook of global energy made by BP. You see that Europe is going to retain its current volume of consumption of natural gas, at least. Not coal, not oil, but natural gas. Who is right? I really do not know, first. But there is a very big competition, and I think this competition can produce some winners that we are unaware yet of. For example, we discussed the same thing at this meeting of experts in Berlin, and there was a suggestion. You see, Russia has plenty of surplus electrical energy. It's difficult to export it because transportation of electricity, you know, it's if it is DC, AC, they have problem. Both ways have various problems, and it could be very costly or losing electricity along the way. Well, it's very simple. You've got plenty of pipelines. Okay, use that electricity to produce hydrogen in Russia out of water, natural gas, whatever you want to produce it as. And then export it by Nord Stream 2, for example, and leave natural gas to Ukraine, to the transit pipelines. It seems like a, well, humorous suggestion, but basically, yes, it is in the future, it is possible. Take a look at some opportunities which are opening now that a year ago, we were not aware of it.
Okay, so I think this is a really important question because we're so bogged down with the present, and the present is not very decarbonized. But if we ever get serious about climate change will have to ensue. And I think the way I think about this is that then the providers of technology are very important. And it's very interesting that China has actually almost all of the means of production for renewable energy at this time. Almost all of the solar PV production is done in China. Almost all of the wind production is done in China now. And then you immediately wonder, where are the raw materials for renewable energy coming from? Well, they've been very smart. I mean, so this lends some credence to the BRI theory on geopolitics. They've been very smart about acquiring, you know, key raw materials or access to key raw materials for renewable energy, particularly rare earths, lithium, for example. But my big but is capital stock turnover is very slow in energy. I mean, we all know once you've invested in a pipeline, once you've invested in a power plant, it takes decades, you know, to pay off that investment and turn that over. So sort of wonder, like, how fast will all of this really turn over? The one thing about renewable energy is that it has a much faster capital stock turnover. So that becomes much more flexible, much more nimble. And I think it all depends then on whether you end up going for highly centralized electricity networks or whether you go for much more distributed networks. And there's two schools of thought on that. Highly centralized networks with big high voltage transmission lines allow you to avoid this, you know, lack of storage problem. If you have a big enough intercontinental, you know, high voltage electricity transmission network, if it's windy in Europe, then China can take advantage of Europe's wind at any given time. Another school of thought is you decentralize everything, and so everybody has their own, you know, can be off grid. Every village can be off grid if they want to make themselves off grid. It's like a whole new world once you move into renewable energy, and I think it's just interesting that China has moved so determinedly in this direction. You know, in my second to last book, I called this green mercantilism because they have essentially managed to completely dominate global renewable energy.
2 points on your point, Thomas, you know, why the OPEC 73 was the exception. In 1967, Six-Day War, the all OPEC members, the Arab members of OPEC, you know, tried to use an embargo and it didn't succeed, right? Partly because they had full participation by all the oil producers as well. It didn't comply. But also, you know, things changed. So 1970-71 was when U.S. oil production, I think, first started decline. You had stagflation. So all of these factors that were there even then, right, helped. And then, you know, looking forward, I mean, the whole green and green dynamic is changing, right? I mean, look at the, and even on oil, I think I had to figure that in 2018, oil imports were only 11% of U.S. oil consumption, the lowest percentage since 1957, right? So that doesn't speak to decarbonization, but it does to import. But, you know, the green and green, I mean, it's becoming more economical, right? You know, price curves change dramatically for a while. You know, and like you said, you need more. There are big investment companies in New York. Goldman Sachs has one called Generation Investment Manager. They're only investing in sustainables, and they're getting the twofer. They're doing that, and they're making it's for their investors and stuff. So all of these things could point to a notion of, if you read every American national security strategy of every president since 1974, you'll see that one of the core national security objectives is maintaining the freedom of passage of oil. The question is, do we really need to keep saying that as a core objective?
Maybe even more general questions for the panel, but also possibly for Abe and Henry. When you're talking about, and this is inspired partially by Kelly's observation of sort of the stories about BRI, right? The myths about BRI. When you're talking about weaponization, this is an act, right? Somebody is doing something. There has to be some intentionality. And there's an intentionality of exploiting economic ties for political purpose in some way, shape, or form, right? So how do I know it when I see it? Because we hear stories about BRI being all manner of different things, right? Pipelines being built as a means of embezzlement more than anything else, right? How do I know that I'm not looking at a lot of projects that are undertaken by countries that aren't the United States, that are simply not accepting the status quo of the current interdependence, the current economic system, the way it looks? They're doing something slightly different, right? How do I know it's weaponizing interdependence, trying to build something and not just something else? And then this will go a little bit when you write the book, is you need to convince me that there's some intentionality here. How would I know it when I see it?
I'm going to take Kaija and Charlie's comments together because we only have
My comment is sort of a follow-up to Thomas, which is to just push the panel on energy to think a little bit more about future energy models and what this concept can help us. You talked a little bit about renewables, but what about nuclear power for electricity generation? Because there's been a number of, I'm thinking of Josh Goldstein's in particular, that argue this is basically the way. That it's fast, cheap, doable, safe, much safer than most people, but politically difficult. And I'm interested in two things. One, what would that look like, thinking through this kind of framework in terms of transitioning to that kind of energy system? What kinds of new weaponized interdependence potential would that create? But secondly, how would this framework help us think about the obstacles? We don't have much time.
this question too.
It's actually related, so I was just thinking, so the whole framework we've been talking about kind of presupposes that there are states, not other actors, but states, who can somehow pull the trigger because of these network effects, right? But I'm thinking about carbon assets as stranded assets, which is a case whereby they really could pull the trigger, but they don't want to. So I'm just wondering how that fits into the framework, and are there other examples we can come up with of things where you really could pull the trigger here? You could play weaponized independence, but you just don't want to because of the costs involved.
And the two fingers.
Just to add to that, it does seem to be the case these days that oil producers have no interest at all And it disincentivizes using oil. Because stuff that's so do anything against people, accelerate. Otherwise, stuff you got in the ground.
Yeah, I won't try to take all of those on, but I think, how would I know? I think we really need to be kind of to empirical evidence. I think the story I just told about us assuming that China was pushing the coal and not finding any empirical evidence on the ground at all is really quite telling. That was a pretty natural assumption to make. And yet there was literally no evidence for that at all. In fact, totally to the contrary. And so our next study is going to be where there have been cases where the Chinese have funded renewables. Like, why did that happen? Was it because the Chinese were pushing the renewables? Or now my hypothesis is those states that have, asked for those renewables. And on nuclear, I would say, like, one big objection I would make to what you just said is it's not cheap. The reason why we're not building new nuclear is it is so darn expensive. Here in the United States, the Georgia plant, I think, is locking in at something like $25 billion for a single plant. So I don't see nuclear as being a salvation purely on economic.
Nature of dependence, not on other countries, but on something in the market is you have no alternatives, right? And so what we've been seeing is a diversification of the energy portfolio in a lot of consumer countries, renewables adding to that, domestic, imported, et cetera. And then you add to it, it's like, if we thought the Middle East was unstable in the 1970s, welcome to the second and third decades of the 21st century. So, like, sort of, you've got, climate change, security, and even economics pointing you in the direction of reducing a lot of incentives there for consumer countries to reduce their dependence on hydrocarbons. Why they don't happen, I think we know, it's political, et cetera, but they're lining up in many ways, pointing in the same direction. We used to think they're pointing in different directions.
You were wondering about why one party does not weaponize interdependence. Yes, if it is interdependence, both parties arrangement. Russian budgetary revenues are 40%. They come from oil and gas, so they cannot make them a weapon. The cost is too high, and Europe, which depends on Russian energy imports, they do not want to weaponize it. This is they exert very mild pressure on Gazprom to comply with anti-monopoly rules and so on. And they want to turn natural gas into the same sort of a commodity as oil or coal or uranium, because, well, Europe depends 1/3 of uranium, or 40% of uranium in Europe comes from Kazakhstan and Russia. 30% of oil, 30% of coal. So it's not dependence. Because they have alternative sources for gas. For gas, they do not have, in many countries, have no alternative ways to get that commodity. I remember one head of a big German energy company told me, if I would help those Europeans to build more terminals for import of LNG, interconnectors between those countries. When everyone has alternative ways to get natural gas, they will go and buy gas from Gazprom. So this is, if you have interdependence, I think this is a guarantee against weaponizing it too much.
No, I'm good.
Well, we were quite efficient in the end. Exactly on time.
Well, Chair.